On September 20th, 1976, at the 100 Club Punk Festival in London, a 19-year-old girl stepped onto the stage with a lineup that had been assembled almost at the last minute. Steven Severin had only just begun playing bass, Marco Pirroni was on guitar, Sid Vicious sat behind the drums, and the girl at the microphone stretched The Lord's Prayer into an improvised performance that lasted around 20 minutes. They had no contract, no album, and had not even considered continuing as a band after that night. It was meant to be nothing more than an improvised performance, but it opened a path that even Siouxsie herself could not yet know would take her so far. Before there was the name Siouxsie Sioux, she was Susan Janet Ballion, growing up in Chislehurst in a family where instability was often kept behind closed doors. Her father was an alcoholic. A painful incident when she was only 9 was barely spoken about by the adults around her, and then her father's death while she was still a teenager taught Susan early on to keep many things inside. Years later, looking back on that period of her life, Siouxsie used the image of a suit of armor to describe the way she learned to protect herself. Many years later, the woman standing on stage seemed very different from that little girl. A direct gaze, an appearance she had created for herself, and a voice capable of shifting from cold and detached to fierce and intense. But Siouxsie Sioux did not emerge fully formed on the night of the 100 Club performance, and punk was not where that story truly began. Behind the name the public was about to come to know was a Susan Ballion, who had already lived through years of illness, loss, and a sense of alienation from the environment in which she had grown up. Susan Janet Ballion was born on May 27, 1957, at Guy's Hospital in Southwark, London, the youngest of 3 children. Her father, Mark Ballion, was a Walloon from the French-speaking region of Belgium who worked in bacteriology and had at one point held a job involving the extraction of snake venom. Her mother, Elizabeth, was of English-Scottish descent, worked as a secretary, and spoke both English and French. The couple had met and worked in the Belgian Congo, where their first 2 children were born, before the family returned to England and Susan was born. Susan grew up in Chislehurst, Kent, in what appeared to be a quiet middle-class suburb, but life inside the Ballion family home was very different. Mark was an alcoholic and was unemployed for a period, leaving Elizabeth to work and carry most of the responsibility for supporting the family. Even so, Susan's memories of her father were not entirely dark. When sober, Mark was intelligent, well-read, and it was he who passed on to his youngest daughter a love of books. Susan, for her part, increasingly felt alienated from the suburban environment in which she was growing up. Many years later, Siouxsie said that Chislehurst had inspired in her a powerful sense of hatred. In her memories of childhood, her father was associated both with the instability within the family and with opening the door for Susan into the worlds of books and imagination. When Susan was around 9 years old, she and a friend were abused by a neighbor. Years later, Siouxsie said that what left a deep mark on her was not only the incident itself, but also the reaction of the adults around them. According to her, her parents never really dealt with what had happened. The police also failed to make the 2 children feel protected, and within the family, the incident was almost completely swallowed by silence. With no one to confide in, Susan began creating a world of her own. Siouxsie would later describe this form of self-protection as building a strong suit of armor. When Susan was around 14, another loss came when her father died from an illness related to his alcoholism. Not long afterward, Susan herself became seriously ill, losing weight, missing school, and going through several misdiagnoses before eventually undergoing surgery for ulcerative colitis. Her time in hospital separated her from school at an age when the lives of many other young people were beginning to expand beyond the family home. For Susan, that period unfolded in the opposite direction. Much of her world narrowed to the room in which she was recovering. During her recovery in 1972, Susan saw David Bowie performing on Top of the Pops. She was captivated by an artist who seemed to have no need to conform to familiar conventions of appearance or self-expression. Through Bowie, Susan began exploring Lou Reed, The Velvet Underground, Roxy Music, T, Rex, and the Stooges more deeply. She was particularly drawn to the Velvet Underground, with their black clothing, dark glasses, literary influences, and difficult subject matter. That world was very different from the hippie culture and suburban life to which Susan had never felt she belonged. By the age of 17, Susan had left school and begun going to gay discos with friends of her older sister. There, she encountered styles of dress and forms of self-expression that were very different from anything she had seen in Chislehurst, while also beginning to experiment with her own clothes and appearance. Susan was no longer simply observing difference through the artist she admired. She began carrying some of it onto her own body. Around this time, she met Stephen Bailey, who would later take the name Stephen Severin, and the two quickly discovered common interests in music, film, literature, and art outside the mainstream. In February 1976, Susan and Severin went to see the Sex Pistols perform in London and gradually began appearing around the band, becoming part of the group of young people the press would call the Bromley contingent. At that point, Susan was still not a singer, had no band, and had no plans to step onto a stage. Susan Ballion entered 1976 as one of the familiar faces often seen around the Sex Pistols. Together with Stephen Severin, she followed the band to many of their shows and gradually came to be identified by the press as part of the Bromley contingent. Siouxsie stood out for her fetish and bondage clothing, black outfits, heavy eye makeup, and a confrontational attitude toward the conventions of the time. In a 2005 documentary, she recalled that this style made her feel powerful when she went out into the streets, to the point that she was almost no longer afraid. This period also left behind one of the most enduring controversies surrounding Siouxsie's early image. She once wore an armband bearing a swastika and later explained that her intention at the time had been to shock the older generation rather than to express support for Nazism. Even so, that explanation did not erase the controversial nature of using a symbol associated with Nazism and the Holocaust. On September 20th, 1976, an unexpected opportunity at the 100 Club Punk Festival turned those experiments into the first time Siouxsie truly stood in front of a microphone. After a performance that had originally been intended for just one night, further invitations led her and Severin to decide to continue. In December of that same year, Siouxsie appeared alongside the Sex Pistols on Bill Grundy's Today program. After Grundy made a flirtatious remark toward her, Steve Jones responded with obscenities live on air, and the British press quickly turned the incident into a nationwide scandal. As a result, Siouxsie became known to a much wider public, but that attention still associated her name more with the Sex Pistols than with the band she had only just begun to form herself. In the months that followed, she and Severin gradually moved away from that orbit to focus on building Siouxsie and the Banshees as an independent band. By 1977, the lineup of Siouxsie on lead vocals, Stephen Severin on bass, John McKay on guitar, and Kenny Morris on drums had gradually become established. The Banshees performed regularly, appeared on Tony Wilson's program So It Goes, and had already built an audience of their own, but that was still not enough to persuade record companies. The group wanted to retain control over its music and image, while record labels remained cautious. Looking back on this period, Siouxsie believed that women in punk faced an additional barrier of their own, because the industry was not quick to accept female artists with a forceful appearance, aggressive music, and no desire to be controlled by others. The waiting finally ended in June 1978, when Polydor signed the Banshees. Their debut single, Hong Kong Garden, quickly reached number 7 in the UK, while The Scream climbed to number 12 after its release in November, and received widespread positive reviews from the music press. The Banshees no longer had to be identified primarily through London punk or their connection with the Sex Pistols. McKay's sharp, sparse guitar, Severin's prominent bass, Morris's tense drumming, and Siouxsie's vocals created a distinctive sound through which the Banshees could now be recognized by their own recordings. That first success did not have time to turn into stability. The second album, Join Hands, brought the Banshees back in 1979, with a darker sound and imagery heavily connected with war, but the tour promoting the album quickly exposed tensions within the lineup. By the time they reached Aberdeen in September, John McKay and Kenny Morris abruptly left the group after internal disputes. In the space of a single day, the Banshees lost both their guitarist and their drummer in the middle of an unfinished tour. The remaining shows were suddenly at risk of cancellation, and a band that had spent almost 2 years trying to secure a record deal now no longer had enough members to take the stage. Siouxsie and Severin did not break up the group. Budgie was brought in on drums, while Robert Smith of The Cure agreed to play guitar to help the Banshees complete the remaining dates. At first, it was simply a solution to an immediate problem, but Budgie later stayed and became a permanent member. When the tour ended, Robert Smith returned to The Cure, leaving the guitar position vacant once again. The crisis of 1979 left Siouxsie and the Banshees facing a very practical question. How far could they continue when the lineup that had created their first successes had lost half of its members? Budgie remained on drums, while the vacant guitar position was filled by John McGeoch of Magazine. Siouxsie and Stephen Severin did not try to rebuild the old sound with new people. Budgie's percussion was more flexible. McGeoch used the guitar to create color and space, while synthesizers and electronic textures were brought more deeply into the songwriting process. Kaleidoscope reached number 5 in the UK, the highest album chart position of the Banshees' career, while Happy House and Christine expanded their audience ahead of their first American tour. Juju continued that momentum by reaching number 7 and producing Spellbound, in which McGeoch's guitar, Budgie's drumming, and Siouxsie's vocals combined to create one of the most recognizable sounds of this period. McGeoch's playing would later be cited as an influence by guitarists such as Johnny Marr. In only about 2 years, the lineup built after the Aberdeen crisis had taken the Banshees to greater success than before. The attention surrounding Siouxsie also began to change. Whereas in the early years the press often focused on her appearance, attitude, and association with punk, NME readers now voted Siouxsie Best Female Singer for 3 consecutive years from 1980 to 1982. At the same time, the Banshees' music became increasingly associated with gothic rock, although Siouxsie did not want what the group was doing to be confined by the goth label. Success with the Banshees did not mean that every one of Siouxsie's ideas had to pass through the band. From pieces of music reduced to little more than vocals, drums, and percussion, she and Budgie developed The Creatures, almost completely removing the guitar-bass-drum structure on which the Banshees were relying. The two traveled to Hawaii to make Feast, incorporating local percussion elements, while Right Now reached the UK Top 20. The Creatures became a parallel space in which Siouxsie could pursue ideas that did not necessarily fit the Banshees. As her creative range expanded, however, the Banshees' lineup once again began to come under pressure. During the recording and touring of A Kiss in the Dream House, John McGeoch's health and problems with alcohol increasingly affected his ability to work and eventually led to his departure from the group. Robert Smith returned to play guitar while continuing to maintain The Cure. The Banshees carried on with Smith in the lineup, and their cover of Dear Prudence reached number 3 in the UK, becoming the highest charting single of the band's career. That solution did not last long. Siouxsie and Budgie had The Creatures, Stephen Severin and Robert Smith formed The Glove, and Smith was still maintaining The Cure alongside his work with the Banshees. On Hiatus, the group continued to expand its studio methods through overdubbing, tape editing, and multiple layers of sound. Dazzle even used a large string ensemble under the name The Chandos Players. But working simultaneously with The Cure eventually left Smith exhausted, and he departed the Banshees. Siouxsie and Severin later insisted that there was no hostility between them. John Valentine Carruthers was brought in on guitar, and the Banshees continued with Tinderbox, on which Cities in Dust became one of the standout songs of this period. The prolonged recording and touring schedule, however, began to leave a direct mark on Siouxsie's voice. A doctor in Sweden once suggested that she might be suffering from a serious vocal problem, before a specialist in London determined that the main cause was overuse of her voice. Siouxsie still enjoyed performing, but she did not want tours to stretch on to the point where every night on stage became a job that simply had to be repeated. In the studio, she also did not want the next album simply to become a second version of the one before it. Through the Looking Glass took the Banshees outside their usual songwriting rhythm by selecting songs by other artists and reworking them through the group's own arrangements and performances. At the same time, Siouxsie continued to maintain control over the visual side of the work. The Banshees were involved from the initial concepts through the process of making their videos, while if she could not find the clothes she wanted, she would draw the designs herself and have them made. Sound and image therefore remained among the areas of work that Siouxsie did not want to leave entirely for others to decide. When Carruthers left, the Banshees once again faced a vacancy at guitar. This time, they did not simply look for someone new to fill the old position. John Klein took over on guitar, while Martin McCarrick added keyboards, cello, and accordion, expanding the Banshees into a 5-member lineup. The new instruments also allowed the group to move beyond the structures used by its earlier lineups. Peep Show in 1988 was the clearest result of that change. Peekaboo was built through unusual sound processing techniques, became one of the group's most recognizable singles, and gained strong exposure on MTV. Peep Show reached number 20 in the UK and number 68 on the Billboard 200, while Peekaboo helped the Banshees reach a broader American audience. The Creatures returned with Boomerang in 1989. Siouxsie and Budgie continued to place rhythm and vocals at the center, but expanded the sound palette with more instruments and a wider range of arrangements than in the project's early experiments. Nearly a decade after their first recordings, the Creatures had developed enough for Siouxsie and Budgie to keep returning to the project between cycles of activity with the Banshees. Another change came when the Banshees worked with producer Stephen Hague on Superstition. The new production approach helped create Kiss Them For Me, a song that gave the group one of its most significant breakthroughs in the United States. By 1991, the Banshees appeared at Lollapalooza before a generation of alternative listeners far younger than many of those who had followed them since the late 1970s. After a long series of lineup changes and shifts in working methods, the band was still able to find new audiences without having to return to its original starting point. The breakthrough in the United States in the early 1990s soon led to an unusual invitation from Tim Burton. Siouxsie and the Banshees were asked to create Face to Face for Batman Returns in 1992, with the vocals and atmosphere of the song shaped to suit the character of Catwoman. It was also a time when the environment in which the group operated was changing rapidly. Grunge and a new generation of alternative music had moved into the center of the rock market. The band that had emerged from London punk was now approaching 2 decades of existence. Outside projects continued to appear. In 1994, Siouxsie recorded Interlude with Morrissey, based on a song previously performed by Timmy Euro, and the single reached number 25 in the UK. Plans for promotion later ran into difficulties when the two disagreed over how the music video should be made. The video was never filmed, promotion for the song was also limited, and the collaboration ended after this project. The final years of Siouxsie and the Banshees did not end in a single scandal. John Cale helped produce part of The Rapture, released in 1995, the group's 11th and final studio album. The record reached number 33 in the UK, but did not open the way to another long-term cycle of activity. In April 1996, the group announced its breakup, bringing to a close nearly 2 decades since Siouxsie and Steven Severin had stepped onto the stage at the 100 Club with a lineup assembled almost for a single night. That ending did not force Siouxsie to start again from the beginning. The Creatures had existed alongside the Banshees since the early 1980s and now became her main activity with Budgie. The structure centered on vocals, drums, and percussion continued to give the two of them a way of working different from that of the former band, although with a smaller audience and fewer resources. After a period of collaboration and touring with John Cale in 1998, they released Anima Animus in 1999, bringing more electronica into their sound. The album received positive reviews but did not achieve the commercial scale Siouxsie had once reached. It was not until 2002 that she returned to the stage with Steven Severin and former collaborators on the 7-year Itch tour. The reunion took place 6 years after the group had broken up, but it was not accompanied by a new album and did not develop into a long-term comeback. When the shows ended, Siouxsie continued working with Budgie in The Creatures. High was released in 2003, with part of the recording process taking place in Japan with taiko artist Leonard Eto. Vocals and percussion were once again placed at the center, continuing the direction Siouxsie and Budgie had begun more than 2 decades earlier. That same year, she contributed vocals to Basement Jaxx's Sish Cash. The album Kish Cash, which included the track, later won the Grammy for Best Electronic Dance Album. The award went to the album and Basement Jaxx, not to Siouxsie as an individual Grammy recipient. After many years appearing before the public under the names of the Banshees or the Creatures, Siouxsie toured under her own name for the first time in 2004. The show combined songs from both bands with new arrangements, including a performance with a 16-piece orchestra that was recorded for Dream Show. The DVD was released in 2005 and topped the UK Music DVD chart. After nearly 3 decades of tying her career to bands, Siouxsie now became the sole name at the center of the stage. 3 years later, that transition moved from the stage into the studio. Manta Ray, released in September 2007, was Siouxsie's first solo album after around 30 years in the profession. Into a Swan was chosen as the lead single, while the album received positive reviews and reached number 39 on the UK Albums chart. Siouxsie took Manta Ray on stage in tours that continued into 2008, before stepping away from the regular pace of activity she had maintained for much of her career. There was no retirement announcement accompanying that change. The years after 2008 simply became more sparse in terms of albums, tours, and public appearances. When she received the Q Award for Outstanding Contribution to Music in 2011, Siouxsie acknowledged that she had been absent for quite a long time, and said that because she did not use Twitter, fans had almost no way of knowing what she was doing. She said she was doing well, was working on new material, and then ended with a short statement, "I ain't done yet." The following year, Siouxsie received the Ivor Novello Inspiration Award. Her later returns did not develop into a continuous schedule of activity. In 2013, Yoko Ono invited Siouxsie to perform at the Meltdown Festival, where she performed Kaleidoscope in its entirety and sang Walking on Thin Ice. 2 years later, she recorded Love Crime for the final episode of Hannibal. It was Siouxsie's first new song in around 8 years, but it did not lead to a new album or another extended tour. Her distance from the stage continued in the years that followed. By 2022, Manta Ray had been remastered at Abbey Road for its 15th anniversary, and the compilation All Souls brought part of Siouxsie's catalog back into circulation. But at the end of that year came a different announcement. She would perform again. They would be Siouxsie's first concerts in around a decade. In 2023, the return actually took place with a series of shows in the UK, Europe, and the United States. At the Cruel World Festival in California, Siouxsie took to an American stage for the first time in around 15 years. Severe weather forced the original event to stop before her performance could take place in full, and a replacement show was held afterward. The comeback did not come with a new album, nor was it built around any single period of her past. On stage, Siouxsie performed songs that had belonged to the Banshees, the Creatures, and Manta Ray, alongside cover versions. The different paths that had once existed separately in her career now appeared together in a show carrying only the name Siouxsie. After around a decade without touring, she returned without needing to reform the Banshees or introduce a new band to stand in front of her name. Another collaboration appeared in 2024. Siouxsie joined Iggy Pop to record a new version of The Passenger, Iggy's song that the Banshees had covered back in 1987. Iggy Pop was also among the artists Siouxsie had turned to as a teenager, when the music of the Stooges formed part of the world she explored after first being drawn in by David Bowie in the early 1970s. As of August 2026, Siouxsie has not announced a second solo album, a new Siouxsie and the Banshees project, or plans for another extended tour. She has also not announced her retirement. For most of her public life, Siouxsie rarely allowed her romantic relationships to become material for the press to exploit. There is no reliable list of her relationships before Budgie, and Siouxsie herself has never liked placing herself within simple labels. She once said that she had never particularly declared herself to be heterosexual or homosexual, and that when she was attracted to men, she often noticed those with feminine qualities. Beyond what she has said herself, much of Siouxsie's private life has remained outside the public gaze. The man who remained connected to her for the longest time entered Siouxsie's life through music itself. Budgie, whose real name is Peter Edward Clark, joined the Banshees in 1979 at a time when the band had just lost Kenny Morris and John McKay. At first, their connection was entirely professional, but over years of recording and touring, he gradually became one of Siouxsie's closest collaborators. When the two developed The Creatures, that connection became even more direct, because much of the music was now built around her voice and his percussion. The Creatures placed Siouxsie and Budgie in a space without Steven Severin or the four-member structure of the Banshees. They wrote together, traveled to record together, and then toured together. Over time, the person beside Siouxsie in the studio also became the person who shared her private life. Work and romance therefore became increasingly difficult to separate. The years in which they built a musical language of their own were also the years in which much of their time was lived within the same relationship. Siouxsie and Budgie married in May 1991 and moved to southwestern France the following year. From the outside, it was a major change after years spent between London, recording studios, and touring. But in a memoir published many years later, Budgie wrote that instability had already appeared before the wedding and that life in France gradually became isolating. This was Budgie's retrospective account of the marriage after it had ended. Siouxsie has not publicly offered a corresponding detailed account of that entire period. There were losses in the past that both had experienced in their own ways, but which apparently rarely became part of the conversations between them. Siouxsie lost her father when she was around 14, while Budgie lost his mother when he was around 12. According to Budgie, although they had lived and worked beside each other for many years, they hardly ever spoke to one another about those losses. In music, voice and percussion alone were sometimes enough for the two of them to build an entire piece. In private life, the more vulnerable parts of themselves were not always put into words. Alcohol also appears in Budgie's account of their years together. He recalled a serious argument in Berlin as early as 1985 and believed that alcohol later continued to make conflicts more intense. Budgie eventually stopped drinking, while, according to him, Siouxsie did not change in the same way. These recollections are not enough to conclude that Siouxsie suffered from alcoholism or to connect her life with her father's addiction. They show only that Budgie regarded alcohol as one factor present in the instability he remembered within the relationship. Another loss did not take place in public. Siouxsie has no children. According to Budgie, the two of them had wanted to have children, but it did not happen, and he later viewed this as a loss they had experienced together. There is no reliable information about the reason, so it cannot be determined whether this was due to health, fertility, or any other specific cause. The family life they had once hoped for ultimately did not become a reality. In 1996, one of the major structures that had surrounded both of their lives disappeared when Siouxsie and the Banshees broke up. The Creatures moved from being a parallel project to becoming the main musical work Siouxsie and Budgie continued to share. They still wrote, recorded, and toured together, causing marriage and work to become increasingly concentrated within the same relationship. As Budgie later described it, music at times kept the two of them together even when other problems remained unresolved. Eventually, the trust between them was also damaged. In his memoir, Budgie acknowledged that he had become involved with another woman and wrote that Siouxsie discovered signs of that relationship. He also described a serious confrontation between the two of them in France and made allegations of violent behavior by Siouxsie. Because this is Budgie's account and there is no corresponding public account from Siouxsie, those allegations cannot be presented as legally verified fact. What can be established is that the marriage ultimately came to an end. In 2006, the marriage legally ended after around 15 years. When Siouxsie spoke publicly about the divorce the following year, she described the experience as a loss without a funeral. The separation did not simply take away a husband. Budgie had sat behind the drums beside her since 1979, helped create the Creatures with her, recorded and toured with her, and became part of the familiar structure of almost her entire adult life. When the marriage ended, the creative relationship between them that had lasted more than 2 decades also no longer continued in the same way. Siouxsie admitted that at first she felt frightened by that sudden freedom, but by then, the structures that had surrounded most of her career had also disappeared one by one. The Banshees had broken up a decade earlier, and now her longest personal and creative relationship had also ended. Not long afterward, the only name left on the cover of Manta Ray was Siouxsie. She did not remarry and has not publicly identified a new long-term partner, while Budgie later remarried and had children. According to him, the two had no contact for many years. There is not enough basis to describe the period afterward as one of prolonged hatred between them. A relationship that began when Budgie entered the Banshees amid the crisis of 1979 lasted through more than 2 decades of music, a marriage, and the Creatures, before the two ultimately went their separate ways. After many years living in the Gers region of southwestern France, Siouxsie left Condom in 2015 and returned to London. She has rarely shared details about her personal life and has not publicly revealed a new long-term romantic relationship. Reliable information about Siouxsie's private life in recent years has therefore remained quite limited. One of the few issues outside music on which Siouxsie has spoken publicly is animal rights. In 2023, she worked with PETA on a campaign opposing animal testing and sent a letter urging a Japanese company to end experiments she objected to. It was one of her relatively rare public activities outside projects and events directly connected with music. As of August 2026, Siouxsie is 69 years old and is known to be living in London. Beyond the public appearances already mentioned in the career section, little information has been released about her daily life or any major changes in her personal circumstances. Siouxsie Sioux's legacy is difficult to contain within a single genre. Punk was where she first emerged, but the music of Siouxsie and the Banshees quickly moved far beyond that original framework. Guitar no longer served only as the leading instrument. Bass and percussion were pushed to the foreground, and Siouxsie's voice operated within the texture of the band rather than simply sitting above the accompaniment. These characteristics have made the Banshees a frequent point of reference whenever the histories of post-punk and gothic rock are revisited. The group's influence can be seen clearly in those who came afterward. Johnny Marr has spoken particularly highly of John McGeechuk's guitar playing and has cited his influence on the way he himself approached the instrument. Tom York has also spoken about the impact that seeing Siouxsie perform had on his own desire to become a performer. The two examples are very different. One found influence in the way the Banshees used the guitar, while the other remembered Siouxsie's presence on stage itself. Some traces appeared decades later in a completely different form. Happy House, released in 1980, became an important part of The Weeknd's House of Balloons more than 3 decades later. A sound created during the era of British post-punk therefore resurfaced within a recording from a different generation and a different musical context. The Banshees recordings are no longer merely documents of the period in which they were made. They continue to be rediscovered and used within new musical languages. Siouxsie's influence also extends beyond the way the Banshees made music. Within the rock environment of the late 1970s, she appeared with a voice, clothing, makeup, and performance style that were not softened to make them more acceptable. Siouxsie took a direct role in determining how she appeared on stage, in videos, and in front of the camera. That image would later be widely referenced in Gothic culture, fashion, and photography, even though she herself has always been wary of being confined by any single label. The black hair, strong eye makeup, and geometric lines associated with Siouxsie have continued to be recreated and transformed across generations. By 2022, that influence appeared in a setting far removed from the post-punk stage, While developing the dance scene in Wednesday, Jenna Ortega said that one of her references was footage of Siouxsie Sioux performing in the 1980s. Movements that had once belonged to a performer on a rock stage were thus carried into a television character from another generation. Nearly half a century after her appearance at the 100 Club, the influence of Siouxsie and the Banshees has not formed a single school or tradition. It appears in the way musicians approach guitar and performance, in recordings that reuse the group's sounds, and in fashion and popular imagery. Many of those traces now exist in genres, generations, and cultural forms very far removed from the London punk scene where Siouxsie began. There is a great distance between the name Susan Ballion and the image of Siouxsie Sioux that millions of people have come to know. One name belongs almost entirely to private life. The other appeared on record covers, posters, and stages, gradually developing a life of its own within popular culture. After nearly 50 years, Siouxsie has become so familiar that people may recognize her from nothing more than heavily made-up eyes, black hair, or a few seconds of her voice. But that familiarity has never meant that the image was the whole person behind it. For that reason, it would be incomplete to end this story with the image of an untouchable icon. The powerful image known to the public has never meant that the life behind it was without loss or things that could not be held onto. Susan Ballion did not disappear when Siouxsie Sioux was born. The two names belong to the same person, but there has always been a distance between private life and public image. That distance is precisely the part that can never be fully told from the outside. For nearly half a century, others have called Siouxsie by many names: punk, goth, icon, pioneer. Those names may describe her place in music or culture, but none of them is large enough to contain the whole person standing behind them.